Mhm. Hello and welcome to this meeting of the Barbados Genealogy Group. Greetings to those of you joining us on Zoom as well as those on Facebook Live. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. My name is Harriet Pierce. I am the coordinator of the Barbados Genealogy Group. Today, we welcome Ward Scott and Winston Beard, who are joining us from Arizona and London, respectively. Ward and Winston collaborated on the book, The Fitt Village Story, From Sugar to Salt, the focus of today's presentation. Our presenters will take us on a journey through Fitt Village from 1635 until the 1970s. We will hear about the history and genealogy of the village, its evolution from a sugar plantation to a close-knit fishing community, its infrastructural development, and the impact of the Panama Canal. We'll also hear of the families that made it home, including the Fitt family. Both Winston Beard and Ward Scott grew up in Fitt Village, leaving Barbados in the mid-1970s for the UK, Winston to London, where he joined the Metropolitan Police, and Ward to Manchester University. On his return to Barbados, Ward was employed by Intel Corporation before later moving to Arizona. Winston and Ward maintained their friendship with a common interest in history, migration, and genealogy, working independently and collaboratively on their respective family histories and genealogies, and Fitt Village. From 2021 to 2024, they worked on this book, The Fitt Village Story. Today, they are here to tell us all about it. But before we hear from Winston, who will take the mic first, just a few housekeeping matters. Please hold your questions until the end of the presentation. And you can either type your question in the Q&A or use the raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen, and we will allow you to speak. Enter any comments or greetings in the chat at the bottom of the screen. So I will now turn the mic over to Winston, and I will take a couple of minutes to just share the slides.
Okay, good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Winston Beard. Well, first I would like to thank Harriet Pierce, the Barbados Museum and Historical Society for this opportunity to talk about our book. Both Ward and I would like to thank you, actually, not just me. The book, as you know, is about Fitt Village, where both Ward and I grew up. And while the book covers the history of the village and the genealogy of the families, we have used the word story in the title, as there were many stories that connected both the genealogy and the history. We chose the strapline From Sugar to Salt because we felt it aptly described the evolution of the village from a sugar plantation to a fishing village. The sugar, of course, refers to the sugarcane, and the salt refers to the sea, the fishing industry. Can I have slide 2 now, please?
This one or?
Acknowledgements.
Acknowledgements, yeah.
Oh, thank you. I'll tell you a little bit about the book. The book took about around 3 years from inception to completion and then distribution. We were only able to achieve that because of the hard work and commitment of several people who came on board. Frankly, this story couldn't have been told without their input. So I would like to publicly acknowledge them this evening. They include Monica Ribeiro, our editor who helped with refining, formatting and editing the manuscript and managing the publishing process. Ralph Jemmott, who you all might know, he's a very popular and well-known Barbadian author, who provided the most flattering foreword. Audley Jordan of Jordan Supermarket. Audley agreed, he's another Fitz Village person, he agreed to distribute the book in Barbados. And many others who have been significant or made significant contributions to our project. Slide 3, please, outline of the book. In part 1 of the book, we cover roughly 330 years of Fitz Village's history from 1635, as Harriet said. In many cases, we trace family lineages as far back as records would allow. Our story ends in the 1970s, not because both Ward and I left Barbados during that decade, but for two important reasons. The first reason is that a large number of young people from long-established families in Fitz Village left to seek opportunities abroad. They were replaced by families who were new to the village. And this changed the village from a close-knit, cohesive neighborhood to a more transient community. It was also the decade that saw the end of commercial fishing in Fitz Village and the start of a tourism-driven economy. And you'll hear a little bit more about that later, but over to you now, Ward.
Okay, Harriet, can you advance to the 4th slide?
Yeah, I'm be having some difficulties advancing the slides.
Okay.
They're not moving.
Can you touch the slide from the side?
No,
We're seeing it's not in projection mode, but if you go down the slide to the side.
Mm-hmm.
Click the enable editing button at the top, Harriet. I don't know if you see it in that yellow notice.
I'm not seeing it.
You see where it says protected view?
No. Okay, let me just sorry. Just a minute. Let's see if I can. Sorry about this. It was working in the okay. Right, I'm not. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and then I'm going to reshare to see if I can, yes, solve that problem.
Yeah, you see, yes, you see that yellow. You see, come around here, you see enable editing?
Yes, I'm
Here,
seeing
yes,
now.
click that.
Yes, right.
And then you should be able to put it in
Yes.
presentation mode from here.
Okay, there we have it.
Okay, if you advance it 2 slides. There you go. So this is basically just one back, please. Oops. Okay, I'll talk to it and then go on to this.
Okay, so
as Winston mentioned, the book is laid out in 2 sections. Section 1 is on the history, and we cover several key items in that: the origin and growth of the Fitt plantation, the slave story, the Fitt slave story from 1679 to 1834. We talk about migration to Fitz Village, transition from sugar to fishing, the early Fitz Village development, the fishing village we knew, and just a brief touch on transition to tourism. The second part is dedicated to the genealogy of the families. We tried to go back as far as we could before emancipation and back to the origin from which those that moved to the village came from. There were many family connections, and you'll see we'll have some discussions on a few as we go along. And we also received many photographs which we shared to present a portrait of those from the village, starting as early as the 1880s through the 1970s. Next slide, please. Okay, so the Fitt story in Fitt's Village started in 1635 with an 18-year-old Robert Fitt, who came from Wellnathan in Suffolk, England. He arrived in 1635 on the William and John, as shown in the stamp to the right. That was the same ship that brought the first settlers in 1627. Now, Robert Fitt had indentured himself to work on a tobacco farm. After his indenture, he received a plot of land, and that plot of land would actually be the origin of what would become Fitt's Village. Sugarcane was introduced to Barbados in the 1640s, and Robert Fitt, although he had a relatively small plot, decided to invest in sugarcane. Unlike many of the small tobacco farmers who saw no future in Barbados for them and would relocate to the Carolinas colony, which started in the 1660s. Now, Robert Fitt's investment actually paid off, and by the census of 1679, he actually owned 30 acres as well as 15 slaves. The Fitt plantation was now large enough to show up on the Robert Morden map that we show a snapshot of, which was in 1880. The plantation would grow to over 18 acres over the next 150 years. And in 1834, there were 41 slaves that were emancipated. Now, the Fitt family had a basic tradition. They would always transfer the plantation to the next generation to a son who had the name Robert Fitt, not necessarily the first son. And the other siblings would be given a nest egg so that they would continue their livelihood away from the village, so that the plantation was always a single family owned plantation. For example, when Robert Fitt, the original Robert Fitt, passed it on to his second son, Robert, he gave his other children 10,000 pounds of Muscovado sugar so they could move away from the plantation. In 1851, 2 years before their father's death, the other children were given nest eggs that totaled 7 acres of Fitt land. And the plantation would pass to Robert Samuel Fitt after the death of his father. So the siblings sold their 7 acres in 1851 to Edward Burroughs, and they moved to Bridgetown, where they set up shops. Oops. Sorry, one second. Yeah, where they set up shops in Roebuck Street, Swan Street, and Sobers Lane. Robert Samuel Fitt, once he took over the plantation, realized that sugar was no longer the cash cow that it had been. And with the emerging village, he needed to diversify. He looked to fishing as the area was right on the coast. And at the time, there was a growing market in the US for the oil of fishing humpback whales. In order to achieve this, he sold off 36 acres of the plantation along with the plantation house to Anthony Howard in 1858. Anthony Howard proceeded to call that plantation Appleby. What remains of Appleby today is the Appleby Gardens, which is connected off of Highway 1 by Appleby Road. So those are the remnants of what became of Appleby. In the early 60s, Edward Burroughs took his 7 acres and he built himself a 7-acre sugarcane plantation, which he called the Risk. Now you can understand why he chose the name Risk, as many plantation owners were looking to divest of their plantations. The Risk actually became its own address, separate from what remained of Fitt's Village. And eventually, before I get to that, the Risk actually paid off for him because the plantation was still cutting cane in the early 1900s. Eventually, the plantation would be subdivided and sold off. And eventually, the Risk would become reconnected into Fitt's Village. We show on the right a pink house, which was built in 1937. The name of that house is the Risk House, and it sits on the original site of the original plantation house. The mill was in its backyard, and the mill actually lost its sails during Hurricane Janet, and unfortunately, half of the mill wall collapsed in 2012. We also show the map, the 1859 map by Taylor, which showed Appleby as its separate location. And then what was left of Fitt's would become Fitt's Village in 1863. Next slide, please. Okay, we were pleased to actually dedicate a chapter of the book to the Fitt slaves. There, as I said, there were 41 who were emancipated in 1834. We were actually able to identify by name 53 of the last slaves from the 1820 and 1834 slave registers. Now, the 41 slaves were actually about 13 families. 9 of those families selected initially their surname, and that number would grow to 14 through marriage. We touch a little on the early struggles of the Fitt slaves. Once they were emancipated, they were given no compensation, and the injustice of it, their former slave owners were actually paid for the loss of their cheap labor. In addition to that, they were not given the opportunity to move, but now they were called they were called apprentice laborers, and which basically meant that they were paid at minimum wage for doing work that they were doing all their lives. However, they would persevere and form the nucleus of the new village, which laid the foundation for the rest of us that followed. We tell their family stories based on baptisms, marriages, birth of children. And one thing we wanted to show was generational growth into people that we knew in the village during our time. There were families from about 6 of those 14 surnames, and we show a couple on the right. The photograph of the 3 boys are descendants from the Knight family. The 2 boys at the back actually carry the surname Knight. The young man at the front, who we knew as Mackard, was actually a McLean, but his grandmother was a Knight. She married an Ellis, and based on marriages of children, also connected families of Bowens, Haynes, Clark, and Pigott. Mackard was actually laid to rest just 2 weeks ago at the age of 89. The photo on the right is of Germaine Herbert. She's actually descended, or was descended, from a union of 2 that came from both the Herbert and Branch families. Also through marriage, other families in the village connected from that union were Cyrus, Duke, and Shepherd. After 1838, at the end of the apprenticeship system, other former slaves would actually move to Fitts and later Fitts Village. Early on from neighboring areas in St. James, but would eventually come from all parishes in the island. One example of one of those former slaves was a young lady by the name of Mary Frances. She came from St. John about 1850. And she was actually my great-great-grandmother. Mary Frances became the partner of Robert Samuel Fitt, the landowner. And while they didn't marry, they would raise 9 children. The first 3 children were baptized without surnames, as Mary Frances did not select a surname for herself by then. But she would later select Gibson as her family name, and her last 6 children were baptized with the Gibson surname. Now, for those of you that are keenly interested in genealogy and understand some of the happiness but struggles in finding records, I knew my great-grandfather, who actually was the first son of Mary Frances and Robert Samuel, but he was baptized without a surname. I knew him as a Fitt. So it would only take me about 14 years to actually find his baptism record, and only because of the work that we went through to go through the genealogy of the entire village. To add another complexity into it, there was also a second Mary Frances Gibson in the village, who was the daughter of one of the former Fitt slaves who had taken on the Gibson name. Next slide. Now, the 1860s was a relatively quiet period in Fitts Village. The sale of Appleby had actually decimated the growing population in Fitts Village. Not that there was any movement of houses, but basically the address had changed from Fitts to Appleby. But it was also a decade of preparation. Robert Samuel Fitt actually had 2 single-masted fishing boats built. The names were the Rosalie and Pepper. And from the 1870s, once fishing started, many actually came to the village in search of fishing opportunities. Back 1 slide, please. Thank you. So many people came beyond what could be accommodated by fishing. So Robert Samuel actually expanded sugarcane in what remained of Fitt's, and he gave that responsibility to his second son, Benjamin, who became the last planter in the Fitt family. But in addition to the fishing and agricultural jobs, the actual basic needs of the village, housing, clothing, and food, were actually locally supported. There were several carpenters in the village who had now constructed houses that had advanced from the original huts to the early chattel homes. There were plenty of tailors, shoemakers, and seamstresses to satisfy the clothing requirements. And in the 1870s, a few shops were open, which would increase with time. And these would also be supplemented by the many hucksters selling their own produce in the village. Water for drinking and cooking was achieved from wells, and these would be supplemented sometime after the 1870s with 4 standpipes that were situated along Highway 1. At that time, walking was basically the only mode of transportation for the most part. Now, it would only take 50 years after emancipation for a church and a village to be developed in the village itself. After emancipation, key events like baptisms, marriages, and burials were only supported initially by the St. James Parish Church, 3 miles north of the village. And typically for those occasions, the family coach, along with its coach driver, would support taking the families for those events. Although the Anglican Church basically expanded and made 3 other churches to satisfy the heavily increased population after emancipation, St. John Baptist, which was at the top of Holders Hill, was supporting the southern part of the parish, including Fitt's Village. But it was still difficult to get to, as it was not really any closer, and half of it was uphill. Now, Barbados had a series of forts and batteries along the Caribbean coast for its early protection. One of those was a 5-cannon battery named Barbados Fort, and that was located on the site where the current Good Shepherd Church stands. That would cease operation in the early 1880s, and the government turned it over to the Anglican Church, who would build a large square building with an alcove on a stone foundation. The square building was a boys' school, primary school, and the chapel was the church for Sunday worship, supported by the priests from St. John Baptist. The girls would need to walk 1 mile to and from school, which was set up in Paynes Bay by the Methodist Church, right next door to the church. That would continue through Winston and my time. And it was only from the 1870s that the 2 schools were combined into the Good Shepherd Primary School, situated at the top of Jordan Road, just below West Terrace. In the early 1900s, immigration and movement for work became a major activity. In addition to Cuba and the United States, there was work on the Panama Canal, which would prove to be a big improvement, not just in Fitt's Village, but Barbados as a whole. Those improvements would basically be in terms of land ownership, housing improvement, and overall economic status. Both men and women from the village went to Panama to work on the canal, and would return. Some would choose to actually continue living in Panama. One of those was actually Winston's great-grandmother. So let me turn it back over to Winston so that he can tell you her story.
Okay. Can I have slide 7, please? Lovely. Thank you very much. Thanks, Ward. Yes, I had, my family had connections with Panama Canal. My family story in Barbados began when 2 young sisters, one called Julia Beard and the other one called Mary Estelle Beard. And it's interesting to note that one sister's surname was spelled B-E-A-R-D and the other sister was B-A-I-R-D. But they were sisters. Anyway, they arrived in Barbados from South America in the early 1880s, and they lived in Watts Village, St. George. Mary Estelle, the younger of the sisters, was my great-grandmother. And her first child, Leota, was my grandmother, who was born in 1899. Now, Mary Estelle, the connection with Fitt Village, she moved to Fitt Village around 1908 when her sister purchased a piece of land in Fitt Village. Now, that piece of land, some of you might know the Good Shepherd Primary School, that now stands on that land that Mary Estelle's sister purchased. And whilst in Fitt Village, she met and married a man called Athelstan Hoyt, and he's a relative of the Jordan family, Jordan supermarket family. The couple lived in Fitt Village where they had 2 children. But in 1914, they emigrated to Panama, where Athelstan, the husband, worked on the Panama Canal. And the family later moved to the United States of America, and they settled there. But yes, we had a connection, as Ward said, with the Panama Canal. Now, as Ward explained, fishing was the main industry in Fitt Village. And the nerve center of the village was a little plot of land, seaside land known as the Fish Bay. And the Fish Bay was where everything happened. Fishing boats set sail from the Fish Bay early in the morning, and they returned to the Fish Bay to offload their catch in the afternoon. Old boats were repaired at the Fish Bay, and new boats were built on the Fish Bay, and by a local builder known as Cox and Bird. And so you can see Fish Bay was a very important part of the village. And many villagers went to Fish Bay for a bath, or to escape the hustle of everyday life, or just simply to relax and spend a little time with friends. Fish hawkers, and there were plenty of them in Fitt Village during the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Fish hawkers went to Fish Bay to buy the fish directly from the fishermen. And local men would also congregate on the Fish Bay to play warrior and to socialize and so on. And children went there, of course, to bathe and to frolic in the water. And Fish Bay was also where the young men went to play cricket. So you can see the importance of Fish Bay. Fish Bay is still there, but things have changed. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, Ward talked about his relatives, his predecessors, 2 boats built in the 1860s, the Rosalie and Pepper. I remember as a little boy in the 50s hearing or seeing the Rosalie. But anyway, they during the 1950s, well, up until the 1950s, the village fishermen used those traditional sailboats like the Rosalie and Pepper. You've probably seen them, some of you who are old enough. With the sails, the mast and the canvas sails and that sort of thing. Hard work, but they did an excellent job getting fish to the village. However, advancements in the fishing industry during the 1950s persuaded many of the boat owners to change from the traditional sailing boats to diesel launches, which were faster and more efficient. Well, it also meant that fishermen, including my grandfather, didn't no longer needed to leave the house at 2 o'clock in the morning to get to the fishing ground by daybreak so that they can start fishing, and to leave by midday, leave the fishing ground by midday, and get back to shore by mid-afternoon. It meant with the diesel engines and the launches, they can spend much longer, leave a bit late in the morning, spend much longer at sea and catching more fish, which meant more money. But the fishing season, or the flying fishing season, I mean, the main fish they caught was flying fish, but they also caught sharks and that sort of, and bigger fish. But when the hurricane season came along, which was roughly between July and October, fishermen hauled their boats up onto the beach at Fish Bay too. Everything happened at Fish Bay, and that was to protect them, of course, from the rough seas. And the hurricane season marked the end of the flying fish season, but it allowed boat owners to inspect the boats and carry out the necessary maintenance work. Fishermen still had to make a living during the hurricane season, even though, I mean, flying fishing wasn't done then, but they still had to make a living. So they turned to pot fishing, you know, the wire mesh and traps that they put along the reefs. And they catch fish like chubs and grunts and snappers. And whether these are the official names, I don't know, but these are the names that we, of course, call them, and collectively we call them pot fish or fresh fish. And I just want to mention, talking about the Fish Bay, talking about the grub skillet. I thought I'd mention that. I don't know if you've ever heard about a grub skillet. If anyone is listening and sort of remember the 50s and 60s, then you would know about, and live near the beach, you remember the grub skillet. The grub skillet was the pot that the fishermen cooked their food in, and the food was called fisherman grub. Now, fisherman grub was renowned for its richness and flavor, and the fishermen would put 10 flying fish in a sort of half pint of rice, and they always notoriously cooked more than they needed. And the leftover grub was then brought to shore and handed over to one of the young boys on the beach waiting to get the grub. And this happened in this 50s and 60s as well, when I was a young boy growing up there. And the boy who received the grub skillet from the fisherman was often the boy who was most willing to help the fishermen haul up the Moses boats onto the beach. And any boy who was lucky enough at that time to get the grub skillet, he was expected to share it with the other little boys on the beach that were waiting for it. Or he faced the prospect of a dozen hands reaching into the grub skillet, grabbing as much food as they can in their hands. And so once the grub skillet, once they finished eating, they would then wash the skillet out and hand it back to the fisherman. But occasionally, the fishermen would come into shore on the Moses and forget the grub skillet on the boat at the moorings, and the boys would, 5 or 6 boys would jump into the water and swim out to the boat in search of this grub skillet. So that's the story of the grub skillet, and I always found it very interesting. And the fishermen in Fitzwilliam were very generous. They would often give the boys, a dozen flying fish to roast on the beach, and of course, you know that Bajans like their flying fish, their breadfruit, and so on. Talk a little bit. Can I have the next slide, please? Slide 8. Weekends in the village. Well, like many villages in Barbados, Saturday was Pudding and Sauce Day. Everyone in the village looked forward to a plate of pudding and sauce on Saturdays, and I believe that still happens now. It was an affordable meal, of course, and for many, it made a change, especially in Fitz Village, from the flying fish that they ate nearly every day. So pudding and sauce was very important, and it was, of course, tasty, and it was a good meal. Now, there were 5 or 6 people in the village who sold pudding and souse. I wouldn't name them. We named them in the book, but I wouldn't name them here. So we had choices as to who we wanted to get our pudding and souse. Now, an interesting point about Fitt's Village, talking about cricket rivalry, an interesting point about Fitt's Village is that it was and is divided into 2 parts. Not official, these are not official divisions, not official boundaries at all. These were imaginary boundaries. And the demarcation line was a shop called Miss Hilda Lashley's shop. And I'll talk about Hilda Lashley's shop a little later. But that any person who lived north of Hilda Lashley's shop was from Lower Fitz Village. And anyone who lived south of Hilda Lashley's shop was from Upper Fitz Village. Ward and I came from Upper Fitz Village. And this division in the village, it was a social division, but it created fierce competition between the young men from Lower Fitz Village and the young men from Upper Fitz Village, especially at cricket. So on Saturday afternoons, there were young men from the village. Most young people got involved somehow with cricket, either watching it or playing it. And those who weren't involved in the matches, they stood on the sidelines supporting the players and so on. And many young women also attended the matches to cheer on their favorite player. So Saturday evenings in Fitz Village was cricket was a big deal. There were 2 cricket clubs actually. There was Shannon from the northern side, and there was Good Shepherd, who I played for from the south Upper Fitz Village. And the players, I have to say, were absolutely fierce rivals, but also really close friends, because all of us went to the Good Shepherd School together. And when the game was over, we often then gathered at Jordan's Rum Bar to boast and talk about the match. Another interesting thing was also Saturday nights. And when you can imagine the scene on Saturday nights in Fitz Village, shops were then, in those days, open until 10 o'clock. And women were at the counters shopping for groceries, and men were drinking in the bar. Their husbands and so on were drinking in the bar. Children were playing hide and seek outside the shops, ring and ring roses and all the children's game, while they waited for their parents to emerge from the shops. While all this was going on, there were women sitting outside the shops with trays with soot lamps. I don't know if you know those soot lamps that you douse and every 10 minutes, and they call them soot lamps, or I think some people call them smut lamps. And they were selling sugar cakes and trays and peanuts and golden apples, oranges, bananas, and that sort of thing. So the whole village, the whole Fitz Village in the 50s and 60s came alive on Saturday nights. It was really a vibrant place on Saturday nights. And it's also worth mentioning, I mentioned it early when I talk about the demarcation line, Hilda Lashley's rum shop. It was also called Club Cincinnati. It was a hub of activity on Saturday nights. It had the only jukebox in Fitz Village in the 1950s, and young men in the village converged on Cincinnati Club to drink and to dance. And there was always a dance or some other social activity going on at Cincinnati Club at the weekend. It was a lively place, and I have to say, some people, some Christian people in the village didn't like it at all. They thought it might have been a den of iniquity, as they used to say. But it really livened up the village, and it was a great experience to even stand outside and listen and watch people dancing and having a good time. Now that was Saturday nights. Now Sundays was the complete opposite. Sundays were peaceful and tranquil in Fitz Village, completely different from Saturdays. There was some sort of quiet reverence about Sunday mornings. Many of the villages, especially when went to church on Sunday mornings. There were 3 churches in the village at the time, while that most of the women from the village would attend, but there were some who traveled outside the village, of course, to worship in Prospect or Paynes Bay. So yeah, we had those three churches that Ward mentioned. Bank holidays were another, was also a lot of fun in the village. I don't think they do things like that now, but we had what we call the kettle drum and tin whistle band. A local chap by the name of Stanley Jinks. Every bank holiday, he would parade through the village, dancing and singing and playing the kettle drums and the tin whistles, maracas and triangles. And it was great entertainment. And the local residents would show their appreciation by running out and giving these musicians food and a glass of rum. And at the end of this spectacle, the musicians and those that were, people would follow them dancing and so on. At the end of that, they'll all go to the beach, inevitably the fish bay, and they will carry on their drinking. On bank holidays too, you had some boat racing, but that was back in the 50s, not with the launches, pre the petrol-driven launches. There used to be boat races on bank holidays. And the boats in Fitt's Village, like the Pepper and the Rosalie and so on, and other sailboats, they will start at Spice Town and they will race up from Spice Town to Fitt's Village. And it was people, you would hear the shouts and screams, and people will be betting on who will win. And of course, whoever won the race, that gave them bragging rights until the next bank holiday. And everyone will then go to the rum shops to celebrate and continue enjoying the bank holiday. So Fitt's Village at that time was a really, I would say, a special place. Beautiful, special, and very, very, very vibrant. Can I have slide 9, please? Yeah, I want to tell you a little bit about landmarks in the village. And some of you would have passed through, Harriet, I believe, would know Fitt's Village, having lived in St. Peter, would have passed through Fitt's Village to get to Bridgetown. But we had one of the most popular and famous landmarks we had in Fitt's Village was a well-known silk cotton tree. It was a magnificent tree. It stood majestically, I would say, along a sharp bend on the highway near the Good Shepherd School. And it was probably about 200 feet tall and over 8 feet in diameter. It was a huge tree. And it became the signpost for the Good Shepherd School because it was right at the end of the gap that led to Good Shepherd School. And it was a landmark for motorists who traveled north of the island. And it was also a popular meeting place. People would go there because it was such a huge tree. People would say, oh, you know, meet me by the silk cotton tree. Nobody knew how long it stood there, perhaps centuries. But everyone talked about it, how beautiful it was, its beauty and its grandeur. And that silk cotton tree became synonymous with Fitt's Village. But sadly, in the 1970s, as part of a road expansion program, the silk cotton tree was cut down. It resisted those mechanical cutters and tools for a long time, but in the end, it had to surrender to the mechanical tools. And I still miss that tree. I have to say, I still think about it. That was a great meeting place. Another one was the breadfruit tree. You see the breadfruit tree in the photo there. That breadfruit tree was a great meeting place in the 50s and 60s. And it stood along the highway, as you can probably see. But like the silk cotton tree, it had the luscious crown that provided shelter from the rain and the scorching sun. And in the days before bus stops in the village, bus drivers used to use the breadfruit tree as a pickup and drop-off point for passengers. Now, every Saturday morning, a lady from St. Lucie, Miss Archer, her name was, she arrived, and built a makeshift stall under the breadfruit tree. and local women would flock there to Mrs. Archer's stall to buy what they call rum provisions, and sometimes they'll buy eggs and sometimes live chicken. So that breadfruit tree had a real purpose, and it was very important landmark. And the women who went to buy the produce at Miss Archer, they all knew each other, and it was an opportunity for them to receive and give out, distribute news and maybe whispers, the latest news in the village. So they all chatted and laughed and had a whale of a time waiting to be served. Well, that breadfruit tree, as you see, it still stands today, although its canopy is not as lush as it had been. And people no longer gather there at all. But for those who knew it, still look back at it with a lot of emotion and enjoyment. Rum shops. I said I would talk about rum shops. Right, like most Barbadian villages, we had our fair share of rum shops and our so-called watering holes. And they sprang across the village during the first half of the 1900s. And they became central meeting places and meeting points for the local fishermen. But during the 1940s to 70s, there were at least 7 rum shops in Fitt's village, at any given time. And they were the main drinking places during that period. We had, if you permit me to name them, it was Jordan's Rum Shop. And just remember Jordan's Rum Shop. And you can see in the photograph there, I don't know if you can see a black and white photograph. There's a young man standing in front of an old ramshackle building in the background. Now that was Jordan's Rum Shop. It had closed at that time, a couple of years. But that young man standing there is yours truly. Photograph was taken in 1965, so didn't know if I would have even be using it how many years later, maybe 60-something years later. But it was Jordan's Rum Shop. I mentioned here the Lashley's Rum Shop and nightclub. It was Leo's Rum Shop. It was Ming's Rum Shop, Ward Rum Shop, Otter's Rum Shop, T. Brewster's Rum Shop. And all of these rum shops were, patronized by local people and people passing through the villages. However, one establishment in particular, Jordan's Rum Shop and Grocery, became a major success. Jordan Rum Shop, let's talk a little bit about that. Because, you probably know of Jordan supermarkets and Audley Jordan, very well-known and well-loved Barbadian. He started in that little rum shop there in the late 50s. And it started as a small family business back in the first half of the 20th century. And as I say, the original shop was a wooden building that was run by Joseph Jordan, Stanley Jordan, Audley Jordan's father. But when Audley took it over, carried the business in the late 50s, he continued to provide, credit to customers. And so many people in the village relied on Jordan for their, most shops will allow you to credit, and then they would, you can pay and you had money. And Audley Jordan was very, very good, exceptionally good at helping those villages through the difficult times when fishing had stopped and fishermen didn't have enough money. He would help out those families. But in 1973, he had converted that shop. He had moved and across the street and had built a small supermarket there. And the business continued to flourish under his management. And he expanded the building to a larger supermarket and shopping complex with parking space for around 60 cars. So where that is in Fitt Village, those who you pass through the village. And today, Audley Jordan, from those humble beginnings in that little shop you see in that picture, Audley Jordan owns several supermarkets located in Oak Spice Down, Bridgetown, and of course in Fitt Village. And so from what you see there, we've got a real industry that is employing a real big business, rather, employing over 300 people. Again, like many villages in Barbados, we had our nickname culture. I think everywhere in Barbados has a nickname culture. And if you made a mistake and said the wrong word or did the wrong thing, then you got a nickname associated with the word, with that word or thing. I wouldn't tell you what my nickname was, and I wouldn't tell you what Ward's nickname was either. He wouldn't appreciate that. He can tell you himself if he wants to. But we had names like Boya Belly. Boya Belly was a little fella. He looked like a little boy. He was a man with a pretty large belly, and he was Boya Belly. Chap name was Bump. He had a bump behind his head, so everybody called him Bump. Dookie was well known. He played a lot of cricket in Barbados. He became Dookie because when he was small, he couldn't say Suzuki, so he always said he would like a Dookie. And he was the Duke. He was Dookie, Grey Boy, Half Pound, and the names go on. A Pinch of Beard. And the remarkable thing is that these people always answered to their names, these nicknames. They didn't hold any animosity at all against those who called them by these names. S-Not was another interesting one. You just had to say the wrong thing. S-Not, if I may just mention that very briefly. Someone asked him if he saw Carapace there, what was the number? He wanted to be funny. He said it was S-Not. Well, it became his nickname for the rest of his life. So you had to be very careful. We had some memorable villages too, and had some real characters. I'll just mention two. Eustace Gaskin, his nickname was Brute or Paducah. He was an irascible character, very fiery temper. He would kick off at the slightest word or gesture, and he would quarrel and fret for several hours. He was forever chasing boys, and who dared to even call his name. However, he was never, he'd never harmed anyone at all. He once famously said, "You young boys," he told us, I was one boy in the group, he said, "You wake up on mornings from energy and youth. I wake up from spite." And he said, "Spite wakes me." So that was his modus operandi. Spite. But then there was one known as Dr. Miles. I think Dr. Miles is in the picture there with a beard. I'll tell you a little bit about him. Dr. Miles, he was one of the guys who went to Cuba and Curacao and so on. And when he came back, he said he had qualified as a doctor and that he possessed psychic powers. Well, in order to create this aura of mystery, he kept himself, grew a full beard like you see there, smoked a pipe, and spoke Spanish occasionally. So some villagers believed him, while others used to call him an imposter and a trickster and so on. But children, including me, were afraid of him, and because of his unusual appearance and manner. But as the years went by, the truth about Joey Miles, Dr. Miles, started to unfold. He was just a simple house painter, but tried to pass himself off as some psychic person. And so we had our characters, and there were many of them. We wouldn't have time to mention them, but they're all mentioned in the book. We also had outstanding villagers, and some of these names might surprise you, that lived, born, raised in Fitt Village, or actually came to the village as young people, and some grew up there. For example, the Honorable David Thompson, he lived, the 6th Prime Minister of Barbados. He lived in Fitt Village with his mother and the family for quite a few years. Dame Billy Miller She was the first female barrister and subsequently appointed deputy prime minister. She was she lived in Fitts Village, family owned land in Fitts Village too. Ellison Lawson Carmichael, a lawyer and a parliamentarian, deputy speaker of the House. Burton Hines, Walter Burton Hines, a famous journalist, businessman, and speaker of the House of Assembly. Glenroy Strawn, a parliamentarian, and his wife, Ada Strawn, who was an eminent Barbados educator and founder of the Barbados Guides Association. And so we had some really outstanding politicians and so on from the village. And then we had some outstanding businessmen. I already mentioned Jordan. There was Sidney Benskin. He was founder of the Benson Driving School. And one of Sidney Benson's students, I understand, was future Prime Minister at the Honorable Mia Motley. So Benskin had that driving school, and Honorable Mia Motley was one of his students. And the Benskin also was the founder of Benskin Hospitality School. Harold St. Hill, for example, was a businessman and proprietor of a construction company that provided employment for and opportunities for people from the village. And then there was the acclaimed Barbadian artist Ivan Payne, considered to be one of the finest landscape artists in the Caribbean. And then some of you might know Basil Forbes. He was the chief scout commissioner and founder of Forbes International. So we've had some real, what we might term big hitters who came from Fitts Village. And then there were sportsmen. You saw a picture earlier from Ward on his slide. Mackard McLean, Chesterfield Mackard McLean, he was a popular bodybuilder who completely competed successfully in Barbados and in Canada. And there was John Moores, another Barbadian bodybuilder who won the Mr. Bridgetown title. Hadley Hines, some of you might know Hadley. He was a teacher in his latter days, but he was also an outstanding 200-meter runner who competed in the Mexican Olympic Games. There was David Allen, who played cricket in 5 test matches for the West Indies. There was Hewley Barker, a popular fast bowler who played for Barbados. Lyle Carmichael, one of a number of Barbadian cyclists that dominated Caribbean grass tracks during the 1940s and 50s. We also had beauty queens. Edwina Beard, you'll probably recognize the surname there. We still back at, okay, let's go for it. Edwina Beard, who won the Barbados Beauty Queen pageant. And there was Barbara Bradshaw, who won the Miss Barbados Independent Screen Show and represented Barbados in the Miss Universe Beauty Contest. Mike Wilkinson, I'm sure all you here would have heard of Mike Wilkinson, very popular Barbadian singer, musician, and songwriter, the first calypso monarch in Barbados in the 1960s. And then we had Peter Clark and Malcolm Bess, who were all members of the Joseph Niles and the Console. I think we might have lost the slides for a minute. Can I have slide 10 if you've got it there? If you can access it.
All right, give me a minute. So we lost it for a minute.
Yeah. I haven't got much to go now, just another couple of minutes.
Okay, let me try to.
All right, I will carry on. If you find it,
Okay.
then put it up. Yeah. I just want to talk about the transition from fishing to tourism. Well, the 1870s, as Ward explained, was the decade that started the transition from sugarcane plantation to from transformed Fitt's Village from a sugar cane plantation to a fishing village. And during that decade, the early 1870s, several new families moved into Fitt's Village, laying the foundation for what would become the close-knit fishing community that we talk about, that connected families during the 1930s to 1960s. 100 years later, in the 1970s, we would see an acceleration, which I spoke about before, of an exodus from of the village families, leading to the loss of that closely integrated community that had previously existed. The connected families that remained were really too few to maintain the closeness culture of the village. And with the influx of several new families, the community changed, as I mentioned before, to one that was more transitory. While immigration wasn't the sole reason for the decline in the fishing industry in Fitt's Village, it did reduce the number of young men who might have considered a career in fishing. As a result, the local fishing industry went into decline in the 1970s. And during that time, an esplanade, a bandstand, and a fountain and bathing facilities were erected in Fish Bay. Families who had lived at Fish Bay for many decades had already been relocated to various parts of the village. And the objective of the government was to create a scenic view to the Caribbean Sea for residents and visitors to the area, so that we didn't have these boats and these things that obstruct the view. They just wanted to make it a really nice place to go. And while it wasn't their intention, the erection of those facilities signaled the end of the fishing industry and the beginning of tourism and the hospitality industry. Fish Bay would soon become an area of scenic tourism and water sports facilities and activities, while the esplanade became a popular meeting place for the village people. The mainstay of the village, which had transformed from agriculture to fishing in the 1870s, 100 years later, was about to transition again from fishing to tourism. And if you permit me, there's one thing, that's the end of my presentation, but I just want to mention something here. And I think this is very important. Throughout Fitt's Village's history, the gaps and dirt roads have been given unofficial names, or had been given unofficial names by the local residents, which were attributed to well-known families from the village. Buildings too, they're named after buildings or places in the village. So all these roads, these dirt roads and tracks and so on, had unofficial names, which everyone in the village knew them by. The first two gaps in the village were named Appleby Plantation, obviously was called Appleby, sorry, which was named after Appleby Plantation. And the next one was called Riss Road, which many of you would know, that was named after the Riss Plantation. But all subsequent gaps were named after well-known families in the village. Some gaps were even known by two different names. So we had Jordan Gap after the Jordan family. We had Johnson Gap after a Johnson family. We had Paris Gap after a Paris family. We had Lashley Gap after Hilda Lashley's rum shop. We had Pigott Gap, which is also known as Mission Gap, after a man named Pigott, and the church, the mission church was in that gap, so that was Pigott Gap. And there was Clark Gap or Toffee Redmond Gap. So every gap in Fitt's Village had some connection to the history of the village. Then in the late 1970s, These gaps were given official names by the government. Some say without some proper consultation with people of Fitts Village. So Clark Gap and Paris Gap were renamed Berbice number 1 and Berbice number 2. Can you imagine? Clark Gap, called Clark Gap for ages, now became Berbice number 1, Berbice number 2. Now these two names have no connection with Barbados. They were derived from a casual comment made by a couple of local residents who said that after heavy downpour in Fitts Village, the mud in Clark's Gap reminded them from Berbice. Of Berbice in Guyana. And Berbice, the name Berbice then became the official name, Berbice 1 and 2. And I know that many local residents were unhappy with those two names. They have no connection with the history of the village. And after 50 years, after 50 years, these names still cause some resentment and dissatisfaction among the residents of the village and the Fitts Village diaspora in both in the United Kingdom and the United States. And they still say that these names were given without proper consultation. So our hope is that one day the government officials will do the right thing and restore these original names, Clark's Gap and Paris Gap, to the village. So thank you very much for listening to me. I know it's been a long time and you probably have a lot of questions to ask. So thanks for bearing with us. And that is the story in brief about Fitts Village. So thank you. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Vincent and Ward, for a fascinating look into the history of Fitts Village. I myself learned quite a lot this evening. So let's go straight to our Q&A and let's see if we have any questions. Okay, so we have one from Mary. Do you know where the emancipated slaves sourced their surnames?
Okay, I will take that one.
Mm-hmm.
So I can talk to Fitts. Now, the plantation owner was a Fitt. His wife's maiden name was Branch. So I believe that is where two of the original 9 names came from. I believe the other names were probably suggested by the plantation owner to the different families to choose from. And those names would have been names from neighboring plantations. So that would be my supposition. But
Okay.
they were suggested and then obviously adopted by the respective families.
Do you think actually we have Dr. Stafford has raised her hand, so I think she may want to speak on this topic. Can we unmute her, Anastasia?
Unmute. Hello?
Hello.
Hi.
Right, Pat, you're on speaker.
Yes, thank you. Actually, I was interested in the answer to the last question, but unfortunately, it's something that I've always found very difficult to understand as to how people did get their names. I've been asked this question before, but thank you for at least a little information about it. So the question I was interested in, it sounded like the village was at its best in the 1950s as a traditional village, and I wondered if you had any estimation of about how many people lived in the village at that time.
Winston, you want to take that one?
I looked at the number of families, and I can't remember the figure, but as a rough guess, I would think maybe 1,500 to 2,000, Ward. Would you say that?
Yeah, somewhere in that ballpark, because there were over 70 families.
Yes.
So if you take the number of people per family, yes, it would be in that range, I would say.
Yes, in that ballpark. And about the names, I also understood that well, there were some slaves that didn't take surnames at all, and they acquired, some of the female slaves did not take when they were emancipated. They got surnames when they got married. And I could imagine a situation which I understand was the case in time with some slaves, is that they left the plantation under which they were enslaved and moved to places like Fitt's Village, and some slaves would have taken the surnames of their slave masters, but others would have taken names of other people that were other slave masters. So I want to take the names of this slave who have treated them brutal or whatever. So it was their choice. And whilst Ward's right, some of these names were maybe perhaps chosen from a list. I think they would have chosen also names that they had heard, from other people. Yes.
Yeah.
Unlike America, in America, the slaves, as I understand it, the slaves were given the surnames of their owners. So if the slave owner was Jackson, then the slaves would have been Tom Jackson or whatever. But that wasn't the case in Barbados.
But I think
they had only first name. And so.
Yeah, I believe other places in Barbados, they may have been given the names of either the plantation owner or the plantation manager. So there was some of that in Barbados as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, could I just sound something to that? Hello?
Yep.
Sure.
Yes,
Yeah, I was just thinking, if I'd been enslaved by somebody who treated me reasonably well, I may have chosen their name. But if I didn't like them, I would definitely go and look for another name somewhere else. But I've also been told that in the French islands, some people were just lined up and told what their name was going to be.
Oh wow! But I didn't know that. Interesting.
Okay, thank you, Pat.
Yes, thank you very much. It was very interesting. I've enjoyed this. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I just want to add a little bit on the whole question of names and naming, because I was doing some reading on this subject very recently. And what it did say is that there was some agency involved in the choice of names. Yes, there might have been some persons who adopted the surname of the enslaver, but it was also a great deal of choice in the names adopted. Sometimes some of them chose the names of people who might have assisted family members, and because some of them will have connections in the free-colored community, the white community, so they chose names of persons they respected. So it seemed to be a very complex way of going about choosing names, and not a simple way of adopting the name of your enslaver. I also think from reading, this church also had a say. They also assisted in names as well. Then, for example, you have persons after emancipation, and then they're baptized. The church also had some say in helping in choice of names. So I think it's a combination of strategies used to adopt names. Okay, let's go on.
Thank you.
We have Janice Mears, who congratulations on a comprehensive presentation, a valuable contribution to our village and island history. Obviously a product of intense research. Kudos. So this is from another local historian, Dr. Janice Mears. Michael saying, hey, I have to leave to, Oh, so this person is thanking you for all the hard work. And I just want that person to know that, Michael, that although you've left the video, it is on YouTube, so you can go back to it whenever you wish.
Okay.
Another thank you from Mary. We have Dorian Straker Corbin. Another thank you. She said, as someone who's researching her family history from the village of Basketball in St. Peter, Maine, North, I can appreciate the exquisite detail of your presentation. Thank you so much. And she mentioned that Mrs. Strawn was one of her favorite teachers at Alexandria
So,
School.
Harriet,
Yes, please.
can I also mention that Mrs. Strawn, Ada Strawn, God willing, will turn 100 at the July 29th this year.
Okay. Well, we wish her all the best and hope that she does make that turn. Yeah,
Yes.
and we look forward to that. Actually, she shares July as a birth month with me.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. But yeah, I was particularly interested in your presentation. Yes, about the names. I'd actually made a note about the choice of surnames because you had Taylor's, and Knight's, Herbert, being there. The other thing that I want to mention, it seemed as though Fitt's Village was a fairly self-contained village.
Yes.
So you're saying there are quite a lot of skills that were not only present, but were utilized. So practical skills, musical ability, sporting acumen, and so on. So it seems to have been very, very self-contained.
Yes.
Can you speak a bit more about that? Any mention?
Word.
Was there any? Was
Yeah,
there any?
let me take that one.
Mhm.
So, as I mentioned in the early development after 1870, pretty much everything that needed to be supported in the village was supported by people and skills in the village itself. And as we continued into the 1900s, as we said, because of all the close connections and maybe with the early limitations in transportation, there were many family connections. So that just continued. It was a very, very close-knit community. We didn't get to, Winston mentioned Peter Clark and Malcolm Best, but there were actual members of Joseph Niles and the Consolers, and who played very, very often in the New Testament church in the village. I, for one, would be standing outside just listening to that music. So, another key person was a good friend of mine. We knew as Hadi. He had a one-string guitar that we used to play music every night together. We actually ended up, I was singing and he was playing on that one-string guitar to a Canadian couple that came in on their honeymoon. They gave us a guitar before they left. That guitar started, I went off to Manchester, but Hadi became a very popular musician on the hotel circuit. So that was standard within the village. You had basically a cross section of everything. And it was, again, a very, very close society before up to the 1970s.
Okay, thank you for that. I know we've been here for a long time, but a question I want to ask, is along with these skills, did you experience any instances of apprenticeship where young people were apprenticed to some of these more experienced, for example, you mentioned carpenters and tailors and so on. Was there any evidence of that during your research?
Winston, can you take that one?
Well,
during our time?
Yes, I didn't see a lot of that certainly in my time. I knew of a few young men, certainly in the 50s, in my time. Young men in the village no longer want to become carpenters, tailors and joiners and those sorts of trades. I think the young men look to work outside the village, especially when the hotel industries and the tourist industries began to flourish and develop. And young men would, and of course, before I say, joiners and so on, it was hard work, didn't pay a lot of money. They had to cut mahogany trees by hand to make furniture and that sort of thing. And I think the younger generation didn't want that. And they sort of would have preferred, and they did work in hotel industries like at Sandy Lane and Colony Club and those. So to answer your question, Harriet, not a lot of apprenticeships certainly in my time for those sort of trades like carpentry, shoemaking, tailoring, and that sort of thing, unfortunately.
Yeah,
and those
I would also mention, because of the stores in Bridgetown, because of easy transportation, you had stores crop up like Bata, which would replace, many of the need of, people learning the skills for shoemaking and things like that, as well as for furniture. We did have a guy that we call the Spanish man who would build rattan furniture in the village. But those type of skills were lost because they were supplemented out of Bridgetown with cheaper and maybe easier obtainable, needs.
But one, I will add, there's one, and do forgive me, I was focusing on men there, men. Much I thought that continued for a long time was dressmaking. And we had a lot of apprentice dressmakers, and young ladies would go and learn what we call at the time needlework. So yes, that's the only one I could think of at the moment that carried on beyond the 40s and 50s.
Thank you so much. Angela Ski, excellent, well done, another congratulations. And Janice Mears is asking, what sparked your interest in starting this research?
Can I take that one?
Go ahead, listen.
I'll take that one from my point of view. My interest in Fitt's Village went back to when I was 16 years old. I did my first interview with the oldest man in the village. I always had an interest in the people. I wanted to know. It was that sort of childish interest and enthusiasm about what was happening around me. So I always want to know where the people in Fitt's Village came from. And as I said, I was a young boy. So I'd go around and ask people about where they came from. And this old guy, he told me that he was born in the 1870s, and he told me about his life. And I wrote it all down. And I interviewed my grandmother. She was born in 1899. I sat down and interviewed her about the village. And I wrote all this thing down. So I had that interest from young. I remember looking around the village, and the first thought that came to me was, where did these people come from? So I wanted to find that out. At 16, I bought a cheap camera, and my idea was to go around the village, to take the photographs of all the fishermen in the village. But that didn't work out because fishermen at that time didn't like people pointing cameras in their faces. So I didn't pursue that for too long. But yes, I had that interest in Fitt's Village and its history and connection to slavery from, I say, my early teens.
Just to add a little bit to Winston's, I actually, after I had retired from Intel back in 2008, I actually got into doing a lot of research and writing. And I ended up, one of the things I wrote about was Fitt's Village, the place that I grew up in and loved. And I was sharing that with a common friend of Winston's and mine, Ben Paris, who I would hike with every time I returned to the village. We were having a swim in Fish Bay. And I mentioned that I had written about Fitt's Village, and he told me Winston had also done it. So when I returned, I contacted Winston. We shared our stories. We also helped each other with our genealogies, and while we were working on genealogy, actually the two slave registers actually popped up thanks to ancestry on my family tree. When I shared that with Winston, I said, Winston, we have to tell this story. That was probably what, we started early, but that was probably the time when we decided it was time to put this all down in a book.
Yes. And can I just say, Harriet, I think it's in the book, but during this research, Ward, we grew up together, Ward and I, in Fitt's Village, although Ward is much younger than I am. But we found out during this research that we're related, actually. We are cousins, which we didn't know as we were growing up together in the village.
But not only were we cousins, at first we thought it was on our respective dad's side because Winston was from St. George like I was. But when ancestry started to break down the cousin connections by parent, we found out it was a maternal connection on my side. He could not be connected to my Chapman family. So Winston is also descended from a Fitt. So aptly Fitt's Village.
That is great. So thank you so much for your hard work. It's actually an example for persons living in other villages in Barbados to document the history. It's important to know about the people who lived in these villages, who helped to develop them. And it helps us to better understand not only the history of the village itself, but of Barbados as a whole. So thank you all so much.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. And I want to apologize for the slides. For some reason, the computer was not cooperating. So we're sorry about that. But your message was received clear and quite loudly to our audience. So thank you again for sharing your information, your great knowledge and research. And we look forward to hearing more about this book because there is so much, so many side stories that can come from this. Your explanation on fishing, not only fishing as it relates to Fish Bay and Fish Village, but the whole change in fishing industry, the technology and so on. This is really important for Barbados as a whole. So there are a lot of side stories that you can explore. So thank you, Winston and Ward. I also want to thank all of the persons who joined us today and those who asked questions or made comments. Thank you so much. Remember, the recording is on YouTube, so you can tune into the museum's YouTube channel and enjoy this presentation again and again. So thank you. I also want to thank our technical guru Anastasia for keeping us on point. Thank you all. So thanks again, everyone.